Hello, I'm Katie Wilson and you're watching A News. Let's take a look at today's top stories. President Trump says he will impose 100% tariffs on European countries that oppose his push to take control of Greenland. Spain is investigating a deadly train derailment near Cordoba. And Australia has passed tougher gun laws after last month's Bondi Beach shooting. Thanks for joining us. President Trump has doubled down on his tariff threat, saying he will follow through 100% on plans to impose new trade penalties on European allies unless Washington is allowed to take control of Greenland. Trump said the tariffs would proceed regardless of European opposition and would begin at 10% from the 1st of February, rising to 25% from the 1st of June. The measures would apply to all NATO allies. The move reinforces fears in Brussels that the dispute could quickly escalate into a renewed transatlantic trade conflict. Denmark has warned that any US military action in the island would effectively end NATO. Well, as the EU faces fresh pressure from the US over Greenland and President Trump is doubling down on his demand for complete and total control, Brussels has called an emergency summit. The row could test the strength of transatlantic ties at a time of rising global tension. Our correspondent Anita Sharma has more.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where the EU unites as U.S. President Trump doubles down on demands for, quote, complete and total control of Greenland. Trump openly linked his tougher stance on the Danish territory to not winning the Nobel Peace Prize, which was awarded in December to Venezuela's opposition leader. Last weekend, Trump messaged Norway's prime minister saying he no longer feels, quote, an obligation to think purely of peace after he said Norway did not give him the Nobel Peace Prize for stopping more than 8 wars. Trump said he would now think about what is good for the U.S. and repeated his claim that Denmark cannot shield the island from Russia or China. When asked by a U.S. news outlet if he'd use force to grab Greenland, he responded with no comment. This could come to a head at the World Economic Forum tomorrow, where Trump makes his first appearance in 6 years, giving the keynote address. Speaking from Davos last night, Norway's foreign minister said his country would not be pressured into changing its stance regarding Greenland and that tariff threats would not work. Over the weekend, Trump threatened more tariffs on EU members Norway, Denmark, Sweden, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, and Britain. But the EU says the Arctic territory is not for sale. While hosting his French counterpart in Berlin, Germany's finance minister said the two countries will not be blackmailed. The bloc will hold an emergency summit in Brussels this Thursday, preparing options for economic retaliation, including the anti-coercion instrument, which is designed to push back when a foreign power uses trade pressure to force political concessions. The EU may also unleash tariffs next month on 93 billion euros of U.S. imports. On Monday, NATO chief Mark Rutte met with officials from Denmark and Greenland. He later posted on X that they discussed the importance of the Arctic, including Greenland, and would work together as allies. Now, the EU faces a defining test over whether it can defend sovereignty and alliance norms in the face of pressure from the U.S., its closest ally. Giving ground could set a precedent that coercion, not law, shapes outcomes far beyond Greenland. But pushing back risks deeper strain on transatlantic ties at a moment of mounting global rivalry. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
Now, as the World Economic Forum opens in Davos, A News' Orkan Amashov filed the following report from outside the venue, bringing us up to speed on the main developments from the first day.
The 56th World Economic Forum annual meeting has kicked off here in Davos, Switzerland. The air in this beautiful, picturesque alpine town city is thick with the talk of fragmentation and need for consolidation. And that probably explains the reason why organizers decided to choose a spirit of dialogue as a framework for this year's discussions. Well, Davos Forum, and this forum is no exception in that particular respect, has always been described as a global altar of economic discussion and a place where the convergence of geopolitics and geoeconomics is happening. Many geoeconomic narratives are being quite often tested here in Davos, Switzerland, and this year is going to be absolutely no exception in that particular respect. But US representation is one of the key topics. President Donald Trump is going to deliver a speech on the 21st of January during that 2-hour session, and many analysts are already talking about some form of the J.D. Vance effect being reproduced. That very speech which was delivered a year ago during the Munich Security Conference, where the US Vice President criticized European civilization and European allies of the United States, are in the minds of many people here. And many people say that Donald Trump could make a Davos speech in the self-same spirit. Well, this particular forum is highly representative. About 3,000 participants from 130 countries are here in Davos, and about 400 top political leaders. Amongst them, there are 65 heads of government and state, which will be here throughout this 4-day forum discussing the world's global pressing issues. And of course, around 100 the entrepreneurs, the leaders of the tech businesses will be present here as well. Well, as long as the South Caucasus is concerned, President Aliyev of Azerbaijan and Armenian president are here. And President Aliyev has already received and conducted a number of meetings with chief executive officers and entrepreneurs of the global order, and all of those meetings have been conducted at the request of those entrepreneurs. Well, back to the point about the forum itself. But this year, of course, there are 5 key pillars which can be understood within the framework of spirit of dialogue: geoeconomics, geopolitics, social growth, human development, responsible innovation, which effectively means that emergence of after artificial intelligence, which is one of the key themes, emergence of quantum computing, are going to be amongst the most important matters. And quite often people are talking here about the quantum leap and about the way our decision making will be accelerated to the extent that the way power and technology are being perceived by us are going to change to the extent that we are not able to grasp fully at this particular juncture. I'll be here throughout these 4 days, every step of the way, informing you, analyzing and reporting from here, Davos, Switzerland. Orkan Amashov, A News.
Spain is investigating its deadliest rail accident in more than a decade after a high-speed train derailed and collided with another service near Córdoba. Forensic teams are now working to identify victims, while rail traffic between Madrid and Andalusia remains suspended as authorities examine what went wrong.
Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez has declared 3 days of national mourning, as rail operator ADF confirmed that all services between Madrid and Andalusia remain suspended. It's after at least 40 people were killed and more than 150 injured when a high-speed train derailed and collided with another service near the city of Córdoba in southern Spain on Sunday. It's the country's deadliest rail disaster in more than a decade. Local police have set up temporary tents to collect DNA samples from relatives of victims, as authorities began the formal process of identifying those who have died. Spanish authorities say the toll could still rise, warning that additional victims may be found following overnight operations in a hard-to-access rural area near Ademuz. The crash occurred shortly before 8 p.m. local time. The rear carriages of an Irio high-speed train travelling from Malaga to Madrid derailed and crossed onto the opposite line, where it collided with a Renfe service heading from Madrid to Huelva. Officials said the impact knocked multiple carriages off the tracks, with at least 4 wagons fully derailed and some thrown down a 4-metre embankment. The Irio train was carrying around 300 passengers, while the Renfe service had approximately 200 on board. Emergency services said dozens of passengers remain hospitalized, with several in intensive care across Andalusia. Transport Minister Oscar Puente described the crash as highly unusual, noting that it occurred on a recently renovated stretch of track and involved a train that had passed a safety inspection just days earlier. Authorities say human error is not currently believed to be the cause. Investigators from Spain's rail safety agency have launched a formal inquiry, which officials say could take up to a month to complete.
France will use special constitutional powers to push through its 2026 budget. Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu made the announcement on Monday, despite earlier pledges not to do so. After a cabinet meeting, Lecornu said he would invoke Article 49.3 to bypass a parliamentary vote on the budget. The mechanism will be triggered on Tuesday, allowing the budget's income measures to pass, unless lawmakers bring down the government in a no-confidence vote. The move comes after months of political deadlock, during which President Emmanuel Macron lost two governments. To the war in Ukraine now, and Russia launched ballistic missiles and drones at Kyiv and other regions overnight, triggering explosions and air defense alerts across the capital. In Kyiv, one person was injured and buildings were damaged. Power and water outages were reported across eastern districts. Explosions were also reported in Dnipro and Zaporizhia. A day earlier in Kharkiv, guided bombs hit residential areas, killing one woman and injuring 9 others. Bulgarian President Rumen Radev says he will resign. It's amid speculation he'll form his own party. He said on Monday he'll submit his resignation to the Constitutional Court on Tuesday. If approved, the Vice President will take over until elections in November. Radev has questioned Bulgaria's move to join the euro and has taken positions seen as friendly to the Kremlin over the war in Ukraine. Bulgaria is heading towards its 8th parliamentary election in 4 years. Australia has passed new legislation tightening gun controls following last month's deadly mass shooting on Bondi Beach. The bill was approved in the House of Representatives by 96 votes to 45 and will now proceed to the Senate.
Australia is set to strengthen controls on firearms. The government will introduce new legislation proposing a national gun buyback scheme and provide tougher checks for firearm licences. The bill was passed in the House of Representatives on Tuesday despite opposition from Conservative MPs, with 96 votes in favour and 45 against. It will now proceed to the Senate, where it is expected to pass with the support of the Greens Party. It's after last month's shooting at a Jewish festival, which has been described as the country's deadliest in decades.
The terrorists who killed 15 people on that horrible day had hate in their hearts and guns in their hands. The tragic events at Bondi demand a comprehensive response from government. As a government, we must do everything we can to counter both the motivation and the method. We must deal with the motivation of hatred and the method, the firearms that the attackers used to devastate so many lives. This bill delivers on the government's commitment to address the methods of that attack.
According to the government, there were a record 4.1 million firearms in Australia last year, with more than 1.1 million registered in New South Wales. Meanwhile, New South Wales also passed new laws last month limiting individuals to 4 firearms and farmers to 10, and requiring licence renewals every 2 years instead of every 5.
The sheer number of firearms currently circulating within the Australian community is unsustainable. Research last year highlights over 2,000 firearms are stolen or diverted to the illicit market every year. That's roughly 1 firearm every 4 hours. The fewer legal firearms in the community, the less opportunity there is for them to fall into the wrong hands, including potential violent extremists and serious organised criminals.
The bill was passed without the support of the Liberal National Opposition Coalition, which has criticised Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's Labour government for not doing enough to tackle rising anti-Semitism. Parliament is also debating separate legislation aimed at lowering the threshold for prosecuting hate speech offences.
You have summoned remarkable strength.
Staying in Australia, beaches across northern Sydney remain closed after a man in his 20s was seriously injured in a shark attack, the third in the city in just 2 days. Emergency services were called to a beach in Manly on Monday evening, where the surfer suffered severe leg injuries and was rushed to hospital in a critical condition. Authorities have warned all northern beaches will stay closed until further notice. Earlier incidents included a 10-year-old knocked into the water by a shark and a boy critically injured at a harbour beach on Sunday. The Japanese yen slipped for a fourth day as investors reacted to Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's call for a snap election on the 8th of February. The announcement, which included a pledge to suspend the sales tax on food, pushed government bond yields to record highs and spurred market caution. Trade tensions with Europe added to investor unease following the US tariff threats linked to Greenland. Overall, Tokyo shares are facing their longest losing streak in 2 months. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni agreed to expand cooperation in artificial intelligence, semiconductors and critical materials. It's after talks in Seoul where Meloni and Lee also discussed collaboration on joint research projects and exchanges. They also reaffirmed their commitment to the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. China is dealing with extreme winter weather, with temperatures falling to as low as -47 degrees Celsius in some regions. Authorities have activated emergency measures, including transport adjustments and snow clearance, whilst urging residents to take precautions amid ongoing blizzards and icy conditions. Our correspondent Manu Makdoum reports from the ground.
China has ramped up emergency response measures as severe cold waves and heavy snowfall sweep across large parts of the country, disrupting transport, energy supply, and daily life in several regions. In some regions, temperatures plunged to around -47 degrees Celsius. Authorities have issued multiple cold and snow alerts, warning of plunging temperatures, icy roads, and blizzard conditions affecting northern, central, and eastern provinces. Local governments have activated contingency plans, including road closures, flight and route schedule adjustments, and emergency assistance for vulnerable population. Officials have prioritized maintaining energy and heating supplies as demand surges amid freezing conditions. Emergency teams have been deployed to clear snow from highways and urban roads, with traffic police and transport department coordinating to reduce accident risks and ensure the movement of essential goods. The cold spell comes at a peak winter period, increasing pressure on public services and logistics systems. Officials have urged residents to take precautions against frostbite and hypothermia, avoid unnecessary travel in affected areas, and follow local advisories. Meteorological agencies said that the cold and snow are expected to persist in some regions in the coming days, keeping emergency response mechanisms on standby until conditions stabilize. Manu Makdoum, A News, Beijing.
Looks cold, doesn't it? Now, let's take a look at the major stories from the region. Azerbaijan is marking 36 years since the events of the 20th of January 1990, known as Black January. That year, late on the 19th of January, Soviet troops entered Baku, which was then part of the Soviet Union, to suppress the growing independence movement. In the crackdown that followed, 147 civilians were killed. More than 3 decades on, remembrance events are taking place across the country, honouring the victims and reflecting on a defining moment in Azerbaijan's history.
36 years later, one night in Azerbaijan's capital is still remembered for how quickly ordinary life turned into tragedy. In the final months of the Soviet Union, public anger was growing. Thousands of people were demanding political freedom and greater control over their future. What followed would leave a lasting mark on Azerbaijan's modern history.
January 20, one of the most tragic and defining dates in Azerbaijan's modern history. In 1990, Soviet military forces entered Baku under a state of emergency, using tanks and heavy weaponry against civilians.
The operation began overnight. Large numbers of troops and armoured vehicles moved through residential areas as much of the city was placed under military control. Civilians were caught in the crackdown as force was used to suppress the unrest.
More than 130 people were killed and hundreds were injured during the operation. The intervention was aimed at suppressing Azerbaijan's growing demands for political freedom and sovereignty, but it instead deepened public resistance and became a turning point in the country's independence movement.
Instead of ending the protests, the violence shocked the population and strengthened national unity. Less than 2 years later, Azerbaijan would restore its independence. For many, January 20th remains the moment when the cost of that path became clear. As the country commemorates the anniversary, people continue to arrive at Martyrs Alley in Baku to pay tribute.
Armenia's economy ministry has announced that the country is considering transporting Russian liquefied natural gas by rail via Azerbaijan. This comes as the country faces disruptions in imports from Iran and delays at the border with Russia. Armenian officials have indicated that Russian deliveries through Azerbaijan will commence shortly, although no specific timeline has been provided. The proposal comes amid a recent surge in gas prices in Armenia, which have nearly doubled. Turkey has welcomed the new ceasefire agreement in neighbouring Syria, calling it a critical step towards restoring stability along its southern border. Our correspondent Adam Morrow brings more on that from Istanbul.
Ankara has welcomed a ceasefire agreement between the Syrian government and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, after several days of renewed clashes in northern Syria. A Turkish government spokesman described the deal as a critical step toward achieving what he called a terror-free region along Turkey's border. Announced on Sunday by Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara, the agreement calls for an immediate halt to hostilities between Syrian government forces and SDF fighters. The deal also stipulates that all Kurdish civilian and military authorities in the area be brought under the control of the central government. U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barak, who also serves as Washington's special envoy for Syria, welcomed the agreement, calling it a pivotal moment. He also noted that key details still needed to be finalized. In a phone call with his Syrian counterpart, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Turkey's support for Damascus would continue to grow, particularly in the field of counterterrorism. Although backed by the United States, Ankara views the SDF as a terrorist organization due to its close links to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, which for decades waged a violent insurgency against the Turkish state. The ceasefire follows several days of fighting in which Syrian forces reportedly captured a number of SDF-held positions, including key oil facilities. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Meanwhile, Syria's government says dozens of Islamic State detainees have escaped from a prison in the northeast of the country. It comes as Damascus moves to take control of facilities previously run by Kurdish forces.
Syrian authorities say Islamic State detainees have escaped from Shadadi prison in the northeast as control of detention facilities begins shifting from Kurdish-led forces to Damascus. Syria's Interior Ministry says about 120 detainees broke out of jail, with Syrian army units and special forces deployed to the area. Officials say 81 have since been recaptured, and search operations are continuing. The Syrian Democratic Forces sharply dispute those figures. The Kurdish website Rudar reported that an SDF spokesperson, Farhad Shami, said around 1,500 Islamic State members had escaped from the facility. The Syrian army has accused the SDF of releasing detainees during the handover, an allegation the Kurdish-led force rejects. Security concerns around detention sites had already surfaced earlier this week when Syrian troops moved near Al-Aqtan prison outside Raqqa. The SDF warned at the time that any poorly coordinated takeover of prisons could create openings for Islamic State to regroup. Damascus said its forces were deployed to secure the area. The Shaddadi escape comes after days of clashes between government forces and the SDF before an agreement was reached for Kurdish forces to withdraw from Raqqa and Deir al-Zor. Under that deal, responsibility for prisons holding Islamic State detainees is meant to be transferred to the Syrian government.
Iranians are urging authorities to listen to their grievances and allow for peaceful expression. It's after weeks of intense, deadly protests nationwide. However, concerns over rising prices still remain, and residents call for the right to peaceful expression.
In Iran's capital in Engelab Square, burnt-out vehicles and damaged buildings have yet to be cleared following deadly protests, which left several streets badly affected in Tehran. And now Iranian residents are calling on authorities to hear public concerns and permit peaceful demonstrations. The protests erupted in late December about rising prices and were among the most violent in years. Local resident Kayhan Golami says the government should provide peaceful channels for people to voice their worries and listen to public demands.
A series of price hikes have occurred in the past few days, such as the high dollar exchange rate and rising oil prices. And these have fueled the fire of people's rage. In my opinion, the government should have acted more wisely on this, rather than suddenly raising prices and prompting people to protest in this way.
Another resident, Mehdi Yazdi, also calls for greater freedom of expression.
The government should at least listen to the people and understand what they are saying and what is happening in society with these high costs and this economic situation. I am a young person myself who cannot do anything about this economic situation in my life. At the very least, we should have freedom of speech, so we can express our protests somewhere and be heard.
Iran's streets have been largely quiet for about a week, according to officials and social media posts after weeks of unrest. An Iranian official, speaking anonymously, said more than 5,000 people were killed, including members of the security forces, with some of the worst violence reported in the country's northwest.
Afghanistan is enduring a worsening humanitarian crisis. Freezing temperatures and severe food shortages are leaving millions helpless, with many struggling just to get their next meal. Aid agencies warn the situation could get worse without urgent international support.
Aid agencies say Afghanistan is facing an escalating humanitarian crisis. Freezing temperatures and severe shortages of food and resources have left millions struggling to survive. Across the country, families are living in makeshift shelters, burning scraps of wood and rubbish just to stay warm.
We live here out of necessity and hardship. Whatever is within our power, we will do. Our hearts long for many things, but we simply cannot afford them. When the wind and rain come, we hold our children close and keep going because we have no choice. The children cry that it's cold, but what can we do? We endure because we have to. There was a time we went hungry for 2 days. I had only 50 Afghanis, 75 cents. And with that small amount, we bought bread for the children. We tore it into pieces and shared it among them. Adults can endure hunger, but children cannot. For 2 days, we survived on just 50 Afghanis.
It comes as Iran and Pakistan have expelled more than 2.5 million Afghans, according to the World Food Programme. Work opportunities are scarce, and many households rely entirely on humanitarian assistance. Clinics report a surge in malnourished children, while aid distribution points are overwhelmed, with supplies falling far short of need. The United Nations WFP warns that around 17 million are at risk of severe hunger, a situation worsened by sharp cuts in international aid.
Hunger is rising at an alarming rate here. 1/3 of the population are experiencing acute hunger, and that is 3 million more people than last year. So the situation is dramatically worse than last year. What we're finding is a confluence of factors. There's a drought in the north. Malnutrition is rising exponentially. We have the return of 2.5 million people this year to Afghanistan, the forced return. All these things are coming together to create a perfect storm for Afghanistan.
Cuts to global aid have left organizations stretched and families without support, with long queues at distribution centers highlighting the scale of the crisis.
That's all we have for now. Coming up, an A News special on the 36th anniversary of the tragic events of January 20th, 1990 in Azerbaijan, known as Black January. Stay tuned.